You are now listening to Jett and Yawn Radio.
Hey folks, welcome to another edition of Reading with Jett. We'll be reading the second chapter of The Jews in America. This chapter is The Atlantic World of Colonial Jewry. It goes over how, basically as Brett Quinn said on our forum, Jews migrate according to economic conditions. That's exactly this. It's proved in this article, or in this chapter. In the New World, a lot of conflicts arose during the Revolution and Britain and Britain and the revolutionaries, and Jews did not help. They simply migrated to other colonies where the British Army wasn't. Now, some of the top Jews involved in overseeing the trade networks are Isaac Moses Gomez, Haman Levy, and Isaac Adolphus. The main Jews in the trade slave are Aaron Lopez, Jacob Rodriguez Rivera, Isaac Eliezer, Samuel Moses. And this is something we learn in this chapter. Jews also ran white indentured slavery, which it wasn't really slavery. They would get their rights eventually, but it's just interesting that Jews ran this as well. Indentured slavery was ran by Nathan Levy and Isaac Levy. Also Daniel Franks and Moses Franks. Those are the four Jewish families, I should say, that ran in the indentured slavery. Now, in the New World, when Jews wanted rights, here is how they normally would do it. They would first say they need a house of worship, just a small house, not a synagogue. When they would finally get that, they would then say, well, we need a cemetery. And then when they would get the cemetery, they would then build synagogues. As we'll see early in the chapters, Peter Stuyvesant of New Amsterdam really did not like Jews. He laughed. He understood this method, the house, cemetery, and synagogue, the three method. And he said, you don't need a cemetery. This is just an attempt to get more rights. The Dutch actually ordered him to not interfere with not interfere with the Jews, basically. And at the end of this chapter, we understand that Jews strengthened their trading network by marrying other Jews from basically around the world. So let's get to it, folks. This is Chapter 2, The Atlantic World of Colonial Jewry. Although short in duration and curtailed by untimely death, the career of Jacob Henry in the New World, that would be North America, before the Revolution, illuminates the ambitions of Jewish immigrants who chose settlement in the colonies over residence in England or Holland. Henry was born in the village of Langendorf in Upper Sicilia. Henry left that region in Eastern Europe and its restrictions upon Jewish economic activity and made his way west, first to England to join the brother who had preceded him there and had become a successful merchant. Counting on his brother as his commercial correspondent, Jacob Henry immigrated to America and settled in the back county of Pennsylvania in the new town of Lancaster. So Lancaster, Pennsylvania. His business enterprise, however, failed in the mid-1750s, perhaps because of disruptions in the fur trade caused by the outbreak of the French and Indian War. Returning to Eastern Europe, Henry was robbed at Breslau, Sicilia's provincial capital. He fell ill at Amsterdam and at length arrived in London in 1757, reduced to poverty. Provided with credit by several non-Jewish merchants who respected his honesty as well as his familiarity with the American market, and buttressed by a loan of £210 sterling extended by his brother, which underscores the value of family connections to Jewish settlers who hoped to succeed in the New World. So basically, Goys gave this Jew, Jacob Henry, more money than his own Jew brother did as a loan. Without his brother's assistance and the credit extended by others, Henry probably would have not returned again to the colonies. For, as his brother informed their parents in Eastern Europe, quote, he was ashamed to return to Philadelphia and be a mere employee, and had no money to be a merchant, unquote. Unfortunately, he fell ill not long after he returned to launch his second attempt to be a merchant, and after seeking a cure in Newport and New York, he died in Philadelphia. Whether Sephardic or Ashkenazi, Jews who settled in colonial America, like the unfortunate Jacob Henry, aspired to become merchants participating in the transatlantic commerce that bound England's ports in North America to Western Europe, Africa, and the islands of the Caribbean. Ships, credit, and the English manufactured goods interest not only a Jacob Henry, but most of the Jewish inhabitants of the colonies as well. So basically they're all merchants. All Jews are merchants in the colonies. That's all they do. Had Jacob Henry lived and succeeded as a man of commerce, he, like his cousin Bernard and Michael Gratz in Philadelphia, and like the Lopez family was the most notable Jewish family in slave trading, and like the Lopez family in Newport and Isaac DaCosta in Charleston, Henry might have become involved with the markets in North America for Caribbean sugar and African slaves, and the demand abroad for furs from the continent's interior, for wheat from Pennsylvania and New York, for rice and indigo from South Carolina, and for naval stores harvested in New England and North Carolina. Jacob Henry, according to his brother's account, would have been humiliated to return to America as anything less than a merchant. One might start out in colonial society as a shopkeeper, but the greater horizons and activities of the merchant and the larger profits to be had in admittedly risky ventures conducted across great distances bestowed greater prestige, and not just upon Jews. For example, in Lancaster, 70 miles west of Philadelphia, where Indians exchanged furs and German farmers sold wheat for English manufactured goods, Christians and Jews described as shopkeepers in 1759, when the town was still young, graduated to the designation of merchant a mere 21 years later, evidently preferring this description. In Charleston, Joseph Tobias called himself a, quote, shopkeeper when he advertised the sale of bread, flour, milk, and local sugar in 1737 and 1739. But by 1743, he had become a, quote, merchant, a case paralleled by another Jewish resident of Charleston, Isaac DaCosta, described as a shopkeeper in 1751 and a merchant 8 years later. More tellingly, the Jewish inhabitants of colonial New York made certain to inform posterity that they had been merchants. So Jews want people to know they're moving up the economic ladder, and Jews that don't move up the economic ladder, they're looked down upon by Jews. The authors of 19 of the 23 wills, that's the 23 original that set out for New Amsterdam. Of the authors of the 19 of the 23 wills known to have been written by adult Jewish males who died in New York between 1704 and 1774 identified themselves all as merchants. Only one described himself otherwise, as a chandler, and the remaining three did not provide any career identification, so they were embarrassed. Those Jews were embarrassed to list what they were. In addition, some among the foregoing, as well as 2 women, identified their Jewish executors, witnesses, and the likes, all as merchants. The ambition to succeed in Atlantic commerce dictated residence in a port, so most of colonial America's Jewish population settled in Newport, Philadelphia, Charleston, Savannah, and New Amsterdam, or that would be New York, the site of the first Jewish community. Settlement in New Amsterdam did not proceed smoothly at first. In contrast to the generally benevolent disposition of the Dutch toward the Jews of the Netherlands, an attitude that had attracted Jews to Brazil during its Dutch phase. Now, the Jews that went to New Amsterdam, they were originally, they came from Brazil, so they went from Europe to Brazil to New Amsterdam. Governor Peter Stuyvesant of New Netherland, along with his council and the colony's Calvinist clergy, adamantly opposed a permanent Jewish presence. It criminated against Christians who belonged to denominations other than their own. They deemed Lutherans and Quakers as repugnant as the Jews. He probably would have been more successful if he just focused on Jews. Within 3 weeks of the arrival of Jews from northeastern Brazil in September 1654, Stuyvesant informed his employers, the directors of the Dutch West India Company, that, with the support of the clergy, the council, and all others loyal to the company, he had ordered the Jews to depart from the colony. The general good of the colony necessitated this step, Stuyvesant wrote. Lest the Jews become public charges during the coming winter. Stuyvesant did not explain in justification that the newcomers had not been able to pay for their passage to New Amsterdam and were being sued by the captain of the vessel that had transported from there. So the Jews are getting sued because they never paid for their voyage. In addition to their poverty, Stuyvesant argued, the Jews were a deceitful race, such hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ. And that's very true. Unquote. Quote. This is still Stuyvesant. That they ought to be not allowed further to infect and trouble this new colony. Unquote. Clearly, Stuyvesant did not approve of a permanent Jewish presence for reasons rooted, at least in part, in traditional religious anti-Semitism. To counter Stuyvesant's order of expulsion, New Amsterdam's tiny Jewish population appealed over his head to the company, that's the Dutch West India Company, in Holland, relying upon their co-religionists that's other Jews, in the mother country to lobby in their behalf. Early in 1655, the Jewish community of Amsterdam petitioned the directors of the Dutch West India Company, citing the loyalty of the Jewish population in Brazil, the participation of some of their numbers as investors in the company, and the history of toleration extended to the Jewish people by the authorities of Amsterdam and the States General, who for 60 years had treated them as they had all other inhabitants. The petitioners also argued that refusing Jews residence in New Amsterdam would damage the company, for if the Jews were expelled, they would become burdens in other Dutch colonies. They would not return to Holland owing to a lack of opportunities there, nor, because of the Inquisition, would they head for the Iberian Peninsula. Moreover, permitting Jews to remain in New Amsterdam would be to the company's advantage, for they would contribute to the growth of trade, taxes, and imports. That's also slave imports. In addition, it was argued, the French permitted Jews to settle in Martinique and other possessions, and the English allowed Jewish settlement in Barbados. The conclusion was self-evident. How could the company refuse the potential advantage that Jews brought to new territories, especially in a colony that needed more people? So, the rationale is, they can make money, and because only Jews have access to these trade networks, and everyone else is allowing Jews rights, so we might as well. After receiving the petition of Amsterdam's Jewish community, the directors on 15 February 1655 ordered Stuyvesant to permit Jews to reside in the colony, despite indications in the decision they sent to him that they agreed with his assessment of the dangers, so they basically knew, they agreed that he was right, inherent in a permanent Jewish presence. Hearkening back to Stuyvesant's anti-Jewish sentiments, the directors resolved that, quote, the new territory should no more be allowed to be infected by people of the Jewish nation, for we foresee therefrom the same difficulties which you fear, unquote, but instructed nonetheless that he must permit Jews to remain, reminding Stuyvesant that Jews were company stockholders and that they had shared in the suffering that accompanied the loss of Brazil. The directors ruled that Jews could enter, trade, and settle permanently in New Netherland, provided that their poor did not become public charges. thus giving credence to one of Stuyvesant's reasons for ordering them to leave. The directors decreed that the colony's Jewish inhabitants must assume responsibility for supporting their own poor and not rely upon the resources of New Netherlands. So the Jews have to support themselves. There will be no welfare. Despite the company's decision, Stuyvesant continued at every turn to impede the integration of New Amsterdam's Jews into the colony. The company's directors had, after all, sent contradictory signals. If on the one hand they ordered that Jews could trade and settle, on the other they agreed with Governor Stuyvesant that the presence of the Jews would create many, quote, difficulties. This ambivalence mirrored the slow evolution of tolerance even in the Netherlands, where since the beginning of the century Jews could settle and trade freely, but could not, until 1639, worship publicly, nor even by the mid-1650s work in a variety of trades. Perhaps hoping to capitalize on the ambivalent attitude of the directors, the governor and his council ruled that Jews could not serve in New Amsterdam's militia, arguing that they did not serve in Amsterdam's or in that of any other city in Holland. Instead of guard duty and general military training, Jewish males between the age of 16 and 60 were to pay a monthly tax into the colony's coffers. Challenging this ruling shortly thereafter, Asher Levy and Jacob Barzamon petitioned to serve in the militia or to be relieved of paying the tax, pleading in explanation that they earned their living by performing manual labor. That would be they would be like the first Jews to ever do that. The governor and the council refused, informing them that they could not serve, and that if they found the tax discriminatory, they could leave the colony whenever they chose. That's how America should be today. Subsequently, however, the colony's Jewish inhabitants began to serve on the watch, if only because of increasing conflict with the region's Indians. Late in 1655, Stuyvesant and his council decreed that Jews could not trade northward on the Hudson River, nor southward on the Delaware, despite the company's decision earlier that year that Jews could travel to the colony, reside permanently in it, and trade freely within it. So Stuyvesant's actually going now. He's taking it on a local level, and he's at this point, overriding the directors, his bosses. As Councilman Cornelius van Tienhoven explained, quote, "It would be injurious to the community and the population of the said places to grant the petition of the Jews," unquote, recommending that the company be so informed of this. In the instance prompting this decision, however, the council, while denying Jews freedom to trade as a matter of right, permitted one or two Jews to travel south to the Delaware River to dispose of their merchandise, inasmuch as the goods had already been shipped there. So they were like, 2 Jews, go there, sell the rest of your stuff, that's it. The company's directors did indeed learn, as Councilman Van Tienhoven had recommended, that the Stuyvesant regime refused to abide by their order that authorized Jews to trade anywhere in the colony, and further, that New Amsterdam's council had denied them the right to purchase real estate. Again intervening on behalf of the colony's Jewish population, the directors in June 1656 ordered Stuyvesant and his counselors not to disregard their decrees. Jews were to be permitted to trade freely in accordance with the regulation promulgated in February 1655, and they were to be permitted to acquire real estate, a right they possessed in the Netherlands. On the other hand, the directors ruled, Jews could not work as mechanics, open retail stores, or worship publicly. So I think retail stores and worship publicly would hurt them. I don't know of any Jewish mechanics. Thereby prohibiting the building of a synagogue, though one had been permitted in Amsterdam for almost 20 years. Rather, they must conduct their businesses quietly and practice their religion unobtrusively in the privacy of their homes. To the later end, the directors recommended that Jews erect their houses close to each other and reside in the same section of town, as the Jews in Amsterdam did. Now, this is a little off topic, but not too much off topic. And we read in the E. Michael Jones book that, it says here Jews have basically a ghetto, but in the E. Michael Jones book, Slaughter of Cities, Jews like Lewis Worth wanted to actually break up white ghettos. So, Jews are very hypocritical. Rebuked by the company's directors for not permitting the Jews of New Amsterdam to trade freely or to own real estate, Stuyvesant and his council did not object when 4 Jews petitioned in the spring of 1657 to be granted burgher rights, pointing out that in the decree of 15 February 1655, the company had ruled that the Jews of New Amsterdam were to have the same freedoms enjoyed by all inhabitants of the place. The petitioners requested that they be recognized as burghers in view of the fact that they paid taxes and shared in all the obligations borne by burghers. Furthermore, they noted Jews in Amsterdam qualified for burgher rights. Apparently unwilling at this juncture to clash again with the company's directors, Stuyvesant and the council agreed to admit the Jews to burgher rights, conferring upon them the freedoms granted to the other inhabitants of New Amsterdam. The 4 men were not among those who had arrived in 1654, but rather later immigrants attracted to the colony, no doubt by opportunities to trade in the interior along the Hudson and Delaware rivers, as well as across the Atlantic. Manhattan Island was a suburb all-weather harbor, and as early as 1656, Jewish merchants there established commercial ties with Jewish traders in Curaçao. So that's another, Jewish trading network in Curaçao. During that year, Jesua Henriques of Curaçao received merchandise from New Netherland, perhaps dealing with Jacob Cohen Henriques of New Amsterdam, one of the 4 individuals who later petitioned for burgher rights. Whether the 2 merchants were related is not known, but if so, theirs would be an example of commerce enhanced not only by membership in a religious or ethnic group, but also in a family. In any case, an important pattern was established at the very outset of Jewish settlement in North America. Jews were to settle largely in port towns. From rich, relying extensively upon fellow Jews as commercial contacts, they would trade throughout the Atlantic world. Moreover, their most important center in North America during the colonial era would be on Manhattan Island. Despite the fact that New Amsterdam, later New York, or Jew York it should be called, was not the preemptive port in 17th and 18th century in America. It was surpassed by Boston and then by Philadelphia in population, shipbuilding, and tonnage imported and exported. By the spring of 1655, at least 13 adult Jewish males resided in New Amsterdam, and this small group petitioned shortly thereafter for the rights to establish a cemetery. The first step usually taken by Jewish settlers in a new region to develop their own communal institutions. Or you could read that as the first steps usually taken by Jewish radicals in a regime to interfere with Gentile culture. The company's prohibition of public worship would not have precluded permanent settlement, for according to Jewish law, worship by congregation in a private home is as valid as that in a synagogue. But the absence of their own burial ground would have made the continued presence of the small Jewish settlement impossible. I don't believe that. Balked at first by Stuyvesant and his council. See, they didn't believe it either. The settlers renewed their petition in early 1656, this time successfully. The acquisition of their own cemetery meant that the small Jewish community in New Amsterdam could remain permanently able to bury their dead in accordance with religious law. The advent of the English in 1664 made the permanence of New Amsterdam's Jews even more certain, for the Articles of Capitulation that ended the brief struggle between Holland and England for New Netherland guaranteed freedom of conscience to all inhabitants of the former Dutch colony. See, the key thing here is that Jews, even though the Dutch were very helpful to them during the time of the Spanish and Portugal Inquisitions, they really never became citizens of Dutch. They always viewed themselves as Jews, and they don't ever pay homage to any country except they're always Jews. That's it. They don't. That's it. That's why they don't like nations. A decade later, the English government reaffirmed its policy of guaranteeing religious freedom in the renamed city of New York when the Duke of York instructed the colony's governor to, quote, permit all persons of whatever religion soever quietly to inhabit without giving you any disturbance or disquiet whatsoever, for or by reason of their differing opinions in matter of religion, unquote. Sentiments such as these could only reassure new Jewish settlers, whose numbers increased to the point that the small community acquired land for a second cemetery in 1682. Between 1685 and 1695, that Jewish population rose to approximately 100, or about 2.5% of the city's population. The small community doubled in size during the next generation, reaching 200 between 1725 and 1730, and grew to an estimated 300 by the middle of the century. See, that's important because they're all pretty much in the same area, so they would be very powerful on a local level. Although offering religious freedom to all inhabitants, the English regime at first did not permit Jews to worship publicly. The colony's Charter of Liberties in 1683 restricted public worship to Christians, and when in 1685 the Jews petitioned the colony's governor for the right to conduct open services, he passed the matter to the mayor and aldermen of New York City, who rejected their request. In practice, however, New York Jews appear to have worshipped openly by the final decade of the 17th century. For a French observer in 1692 reported that Jews, Protestant dissenters, and Catholics each had their, quote, own church and freedom of religion, unquote. A map of the city in 1695 identifies the site of a synagogue, while a real estate document in 1700 mentions a house on Mill Street, quote, commonly known by the name of the Jews' Synagogue, unquote. That house, rented from a Christian, continued to serve as a synagogue until 1728, when the Jewish community decided to build its first permanent synagogue structure. In 1731, the Jews erected a two-story wooden building to serve as a school, as a meeting hall for the congregation and its officers, and at times as a residence for the schoolmaster. At approximately the same date, the community erected a ritual bath and booth for use on Sukkot, the autumn festival of tabernacles. In 1758, the congregation completed its complex by purchasing a house next to the synagogue to provide housing for the shamash, the salaried employee who cared for its buildings, and called the congregation's members to prayer at the appointed hours. So that's like a pastor slash janitor. A shamash. A shamash is a Jewish janitor. In the main, the Jews of colonial New York pursued careers as merchants, trading with England, Africa, the Caribbean islands, and the other major ports of North America. Between 25 March and 25 June 1701, over half of the shipments of Jewish merchants went from New York to Barbados and consisted primarily of coconut rum, wine, fur, and textiles. Between 18 April and 25 December 1705, cargoes dispatched by the city's Jewish merchants went to Jamaica, Barbados, London, Rhode Island, Boston, and Guinea, and included rum, wine, cloth, and cordage. In the year that begun on 24 June 1725, shipments that included coconuts, coral, tobacco, turpentine, sturgeon, wine, and rum were sent to Jamaica, Curaçao, Barbados, Martinique, London, and Bristol. A decade later, ships destined for England, St. Thomas, South Carolina, Curaçao, Holland, Newfoundland, Jamaica, and St. Christopher cleared New York's harbor with salt, cotton, sugar, slaves, bottles, bricks, coconuts, pork, textiles, tobacco, and onions on board. Throughout the colonial era, Jewish merchants located in New York traded across the length and breadth of the Atlantic and, quote, constituted at one time at least a major segment of mercantile population. So all the ships were Jewish owned, or at least, and were an important part of colonial trade, unquote. Jewish merchants reached into the interior as well. To judge from a ledger book attributed to Daniel Gomez, who was a member of colonial New York's preemptive Sephardic family, Gomez's commercial ventures reached to England, Holland, Madeira, Curaçao, Jamaica, Barbados, the North American ports of Newport, Charleston, New Haven, and Philadelphia, and also deeper into the interior. And also deeper into the interior. That's the New World itself. To Albany, New Rochelle, Goshen, Kinderhook, and Rhinebeck in New York, and Allentown and Lancaster in Pennsylvania. But a while these locations did not front the ocean, they were as much a part of the Atlantic commercial world of the 18th century as were the port towns. The furs, grains, meats, tobacco, rice, indigo, lumber, and naval stores harvested in North America, in the North American hinterland, were exported abroad to purchase the manufactured goods, sugars, and slaves imported from England, the Caribbean, and Africa. Gomez is a slave trader. Gomez's father exported considerable quantities of wheat to Madeira and probably to Lisbon, while the son maintained a post near Newburgh in upper New York, where he traded with the Indians, undoubtedly procuring furs from them to export. Gomez and others like him, such as fellow New York Jewish merchants Isaac Adolphus and Haman Levy, served to link the continent's interior to the greater world of Atlantic commerce. Successful as merchants, the Jewish inhabitants of New York prospered in the tolerant, pluralistic environment of the city. A visitor to New York City, Peter Kalm, noted the following in the late 1740s. The Jews, quote, possess great privileges. They have a synagogue and great country seats of their own property, and are allowed to keep shops in town. They likewise have several ships which they freight and send out with their own goods. In fine, they enjoy all the privileges common to other inhabitants of the town and province, unquote. For New York Jews, however, the pleasantness of the colonial era came to a precipitous close in the autumn of 1776 with the occupation of the city by the British Army. Most of the Jewish population fled, many of them to Philadelphia, and did not return until the 1780s. During their absence, the handful of Jews who remained behind, many of them loyal to the crown, cared for the synagogue complex where organized communal life resumed in 1783 with the return of those who, choosing the American cause in the Revolution, had gone into exile. Rather than gone into exile, they should have fought in the war. In 1658, or shortly thereafter, a small Jewish community developed in the town of Newport, Rhode Island, several hundred miles northeast of Manhattan Island. These estimated 15 families, who created the first Jewish settlement in an English colony on the North American mainland, came from the English island of Barbados. Interested in settling in a New England port town, they were attracted by Rhode Island's reputation for religious toleration. In contrast to the insistence upon religious uniformity in 17th century Massachusetts and Connecticut, where the courts enforced orthodox Puritanism with fines, flogging, banishment, and capital punishment in severe cases of heterodoxy, Rhode Island offered a haven for dissenters. Rhode Island's first settlement had been established in 1636 at Providence by the Reverend Roger Williams, who, after differing theologically with Massachusetts clergy, had fled southward. He was followed in 1637 by Anne Hutchinson, who, after her trial, in which she was found to be guilty of heresy, founded Newport with her adherents. As the two towns grew, they attracted other nonconformists. In Providence, Williams preached a gospel of toleration, while nearby Newport, in the words of one contemporary hostile observer, served as, quote, a receptacle for people of several sorts and opinions, unquote. Dissenters made their way to Newport, even from Dutch New Amsterdam, finding there the toleration not permitted by Governor Peter Stuyvesant and the Calvinist clergy of New Netherland, one of whom described Rhode Island as, quote, the receptacle of all sorts of riffraff people, and nothing less than the sewer of New England, unquote. The Jews who settled in Newport chose well, therefore immigrating from one English colony to another, rather than to the Dutch colony on Manhattan Island. And in Newport they found the settlement that afforded the greatest degree of religious freedom anywhere in North America at the middle of the 17th century. Little is known of these Jews, except that they purchased land for a cemetery in 1677, and that they engaged in trade. The later is apparent because of two suits, in 1684 and 1685, against a number of Jews for alleged violations of the English Navigation Acts. During the 1690s, the small community grew with the arrival of 90 individuals from Caraco, refugees from a devastating epidemic in 1693 on that island. By the middle of the 18th century, between 15 and 20 Jewish families lived in Newport, rising to approximately 30 households in 1770. Like their counterparts in New York, the Jews of 18th century Newport pursued careers as merchants, trading throughout the Atlantic region. The three members of the community who held title to the land on which the community built its synagogue, Jacob Rodriguez Rivera, Moses Levy, and Isaac Hart, were all identified in the deed to the property as merchants, as were Isaac Eliezer, Naphtali Hart, Jacob Isaacs, and Meyer Pollock, who participated in the building's construction. So that they participated in the synagogues. They financed the synagogue's construction. But the most prominent of all was Aaron Lopez, whose vessels called at ports throughout England's mainland colonies, the Caribbean, the coast of South America, England, Ireland, Holland, Sweden, Spain, Portugal, the Azores, and the Canaries. Lopez traded in most of the goods transported across the Atlantic in the middle of the 18th century: rum, hardware, textiles, candles, oil, sugar, naval stores, lumber, fish, flour, meat, and slaves. A refugee. Now, the Lopez family, as we discussed, as some listeners discussed on our forums, Aaron Lopez and I think his brother Gabriel were the most prominent of the Jewish slave traders. But there's also Jacob Rodriguez Rivera, Isaac Eliezer, who also, those two were involved in the building of this synagogue. They were also slave trading Jews, as was Samuel Moses. A refugee from the Inquisition, this is about Lopez now. Lopez arrived in Newport from Portugal in 1752, and before the middle of the following decade, owned and constructed vessels, some of which he exported for sale. Moreover, he participated in the lucrative slave trade, shipping rum and hardware to Africa, and returning with slaves for sale in the New World. Other Newport Jewish merchants such as Jacob Rodriguez Rivera, Isaac Eliezer, and Samuel Moses, along with their Christian counterparts, participated as well in the transatlantic shipment of slaves. It says Christian counterparts, but they were once, the auctions and things like that, the buyers but the actual transportation was heavily Jewish. In 1754, nearly a century after their first synagogue appeared there, after their first appearance there, the Jews of Newport began to construct a synagogue. In 1759, they broke ground for it, completed most of the building in 1762, and dedicated it late in 1763. Although not entirely finished at the time of its dedication, the Reverend Ezra Stiles of Newport found it to be in, quote, edifice of the most perfect of the temple kind perhaps in America, one that could not but raise in the mind a faint idea of the majesty and grandeur of the ancient Jewish worship mentioned in the Scripture, unquote. Unfortunately, the congregation was not to enjoy it for long, as in New York, the occupation of the city by the British in 1776 prompted most of the members to leave, an event from which the community recovered only briefly during the 1780s. To the south, Philadelphia's Jewish community owed its genesis to immigrants from New York. Founded in 1685 by William Penn as a haven for Quakers and other dissenters, the city surpassed New York's population by 1720, when it numbered 10,000 inhabitants to New York's 7,000. In 1742, Philadelphia had 13,000 residents, second only to Boston's 16,000, while New York's population stood in North America at 11,000. Shipbuilding increased rapidly between 1725 and 1750 on the heels of a soaring export trade in foodstuffs, lumber, livestock, and wool. During the second quarter of the 18th century, the city served as a principal port of entry for newcomers to America, for Pennsylvania attracted Germans and Scotch-Irish settlers in considerable numbers. With the city's rapid growth, Jewish settlers began to make their way to yet another gateway to the Atlantic, one that functioned as the portal to a significant hinterland as well. As if to test Philadelphia's viability as a commercial center, individual Jewish merchants visit the city to trade there during the early years of the 18th century. Between 1706 and 1709, 6 Jews from New York and the Caribbean islands are known to have appeared there. While between 1715 and 1720, at least one Jewish New Yorker, Abraham Lucena, apparently had more lasting commercial interest in Philadelphia, for he came to the city on at least 8 occasions. The New York Jewish community also knew of Philadelphia's growth and development firsthand from the visit there by Daniel Gomez in 1719. Now, Gomez was one of the top Jews involved in the trading networks, the Atlantic colonial trades. Not necessarily Jews, but pretty much all. He was the overseer of all of the networks. Permanent settlement in Philadelphia by New Yorkers, however, did not begin until 1713, when Nathan and Isaac Levy immigrated from New York to William Penn's city on the Delaware, where they quickly entered its commercial life. The Levy brothers imported manufactured goods from England, but they specialized in placing servants from abroad with masters to whom these servants were indentured for 7 years in order to pay their fares to the New World. I didn't know that Nathan and Isaac Levy are actually controlling the indentured servants. That's white slavery. Wasn't exactly slavery. They would get freedom, but in return for the landlord paying their journey over here. But still, Jews ran even white slavery at this time. In 1738, 2 other New York brothers, David and Moses Franks, joined the Levy brothers. David Franks joined Nathan Levy in a partnership that shipped timber, wheat, corn, and meat regularly to London, and imported English goods in return, frequently on vessels owned by the 2 partners, 2 Jews. During the 1740s and 1750s, other Jewish settlers established residents in the city, some coming from New York, others directly from Europe, gathering around the nucleus of the Levies and Franks. Even after he married out of the Jewish faith in 1743 and raised his children as Christians, we learned earlier they never really do, but David Franks continued to serve as an agent of, here we go. David Franks continued to serve as an agent of Jewish settlement. During the 1750s, he launched Bernard Gratz, a cousin of the unfortunate Jacob Henry described earlier, in his career as a merchant, employing him as a clerk when he arrived from England. In time, Gratz and his brother Michael, who subsequently joined him in Philadelphia, provided leadership for Philadelphia's organized Jewish community, which by 1765 contained about 25 families, at least half of them headed by men identifiable as merchants. 5 years later, the city's Jewish families included probably 100 individuals. True to the pattern in the settlements to the north, the first step in the development of a commercial infrastructure was the acquisition of land for a cemetery. In 1740, Nathan Levy purchased land for a family burial plot. In subsequent years, it served the entire community. Prayer was held in private homes, but by 1761, with the number of Jewish inhabitants increasing through immigration and births, talk of constructing a synagogue began. The elements of an organized community began to appear during the 1760s, when the emerging congregation employed a caretaker, acquired additional land for the cemetery, and maintained a fund for those in need. In 1771, worship finally began in rented quarters. So worship actually began before the revolution took place. Jews were allowed to not really pray, but debate the Talmud. A governing structure was created 3 years at the latest before the outbreak of the revolution. In February 1773, the Board of Elders, known as the Muhammad, M-A-H-A-M-A-A-D, in the Sephardic tradition, with Bernard Gratz as its president, resolved that, quote, in order to support our holy worship and establish it on a more solid foundation, unquote, money should be collected for the quote, uses of the synagogue now established in the city of Philadelphia, unquote. Finally, on the eve of the Declaration of Independence, Michael Gratz engaged a Hazan, quote, for and in behalf of the Jewish society, unquote, who agreed to serve also as a ritual slaughterer and to teach the Hebrew language to children in return for an annual salary, board, and lodging. Little did Gratz and his fellow congregants know that they were about to be engulfed by an influx of Jews from New York, fleeing from the British capture of that port city at the mouth of the Hudson River. Approximately 70 miles to the west of Philadelphia, a small but significant Jewish presence arose in Lancaster, beginning with the arrival of Joseph Simon in the early 1740s. Simon served as the nucleus around which other Jewish settlers gathered, providing a room in his house for worship, 2 Torah scrolls, and land for a cemetery. While some, the luckless Jacob Henry described earlier, came and went, others remained more permanently until this small gathering of Jews in Philadelphia's hinterland faded away late in the 18th century, disappearing altogether at Simon's death in 1804. Simon and the others who joined him chose Lancaster because of its role as the commercial center of western Pennsylvania, Maryland, and part of Virginia. Lancaster was a vital crossroad to the west and a linchpin in the defense of the interior. It grew to become the largest hinterland settlement in British North America. Its merchants funneled the furs supplied by Indians and white trappers and the wheat raised by the large local population of German farmers to Philadelphia for export. They returned with all the manner of foreign commodities for distribution in the interior. Joseph Simon, for example, in 1706, imported sugar to Lancaster. Early in 1762, he advertised the sale of hardware, cooking utensils, farming implements, weapons, tea chests, and toys from England, and later that year he shipped raccoon and beaver furs to Philadelphia, requesting in return a shipment that included textiles, sugar, coffee, and indigo. Simon and his fellow Jews in Lancaster were as dependent upon Atlantic trade as the merchants who resided in the ports. So the Jews in Lancaster, like Simon, did business with other Jews in North America. Far to the south, 4 Jewish settlers appeared in Charleston, South Carolina, by 1697. Settlement there, however, remained meager during the first half of the 18th century. For between 1695 and 1750, only 15 adult Jewish men are known to have resided there. As in the north, most were identifiable as merchants. With the arrival of several newcomers from London in 1750, the small community organized a congregation and adopted governing regulations in 1756. Thereafter, their numbers appear to have increased steadily, for between 1750 and 1783, 51 Jewish family names appeared in Charleston. Though not all who bore them settled there permanently, by 1775 the community contemplated building a synagogue and unsuccessfully requested funds from New York's Jewish congregation for that purpose. So there weren't enough Jews there for the New York Jews to fund the synagogue. The Jews of Charleston, in any case, were unable to begin the construction of a permanent house of worship, that would be synagogue, until 1792. They dedicated it for use in 1794. The settlement by 42 Jews in Savannah, Georgia, in 1733, sponsored, as noted previously, by the Sephardic community of London in order to relieve themselves of some of their poor, faltered within 8 years. By 1741, most were gone, immigrating to Charleston and New York, following the outbreak of war between England and Spain. Only 3 families remained. In 1750, they numbered 16 individuals in a population of approximately 3,000. During the 1760s, the arrival of a few more individuals augmented the tiny group, and in 1771, perhaps 6 million families comprised the Jewish population of Savannah. Already, however, they endeavored to function as a congregation, for in 1774 they resolved that, quote, having a significant number of Jews here to make a congregation, unquote, they would meet at the home of one of their members as, quote, a congregation of Jews, unquote. Shortly thereafter, however, the outbreak of the Revolution thoroughly disrupted their lives. As one wrote, quote, the American Revolution at this time throughout America The American Revolution at this time throughout America did affect many Jews to be continually coming and going. Unquote. As for the colonial era close, Georgia's Jews were thus thwarted by war for a second time. Significant growth and development would not come until the 1790s. Seemingly inconsequential because of their tiny numbers, the Jews of colonial Savannah exhibited the orientation to the larger Atlantic world that characterized all of colonial Jewry, and therein lies their significance. For one, like their counterparts in North America's other settlements, they relied upon contacts with other Atlantic Jewish communities for religious purpose. Accordingly, in 1737, they received books, a Torah scroll, and a Hanukkah candelabrum from one of the London Jews. For another, they built relationships with other Jewish communities through marriage. In 1761, for example, Mordecai Sheftal married the sister of a Charleston resident. 6 years later, Daniel Nunez wed a woman from New York's Jewish community. In 1768, Levi Sheftal married a 14-year-old on the island of St. Croix and brought her to Savannah. thereby creating a link with the Caribbean. And in 1774, Philip Minnes married Judith Pollock in Newport and returned with her to Savannah. The practice of marrying around the Atlantic cemented existing mercantile Jews, created new ones, and contributed to the Jewish community in the New World. So basically, Jews married around the world, and that created new trading networks, even more Jewish trading networks. America's Jews were members of an ethnic group of traders that reached around the Atlantic and spread as far as India in the 18th century. In spite of the wide expansion of the Atlantic trading world, Jewish merchants readily found one another and established ties, both personal and professional. To do so, they needed to travel great distances. From the vantage point of the late 20th century, with its ease and speed of travel over vast distances and under generally safe conditions, the propensity of colonial Jewish merchants to travel widely and frequently by vastly slower means and under far more perilous circumstances seems nothing short of extraordinary. Indeed, their journeys among the ports of North America, the Caribbean, and England were an essential part of their educations, providing knowledge of market conditions abroad, familiarity with the products of a variety of countries, and perhaps above all, contacts with their colleagues in commerce and religion. The voyage of Newport's Moses Lopez to Charleston in 1764 illustrates the advantages bestowed by ethnic and religious ties and by the journeys that brought co-religionists together. That should be the advantages of being a Jew. Lopez, representing his successful half-brother Aaron, these are the most predominant slave trading Jews, as well as Jacob Rodriguez Rivera, the latter's father-in-law, traveled to South Carolina to sell a cargo that included spermaceti and tallow candles, soap, biscuits, flour, fish, axes, and desks, and either to sell the vessel on which he had sailed and which belonged to Aaron, or to procure a cargo for it and to dispatch it to London. Lopez, who had last seen Charleston 22 years before, was fortunate to have as his contact there Isaac DaCosta, the Jewish community's Hazan, who had arrived in Charleston prior to 1750 and had progressed from shopkeeper to merchant during the 1750s. In addition, DaCosta had for several years corresponded with Aaron Lopez, selling merchandise on commission as Aaron's agent in the port of Charleston. Welcoming Moses Lopez, DaCosta insisted that he reside in his home, offering him its best room. Moses could thus observe the Sabbath in a Jewish household, as he indicated in one of his letters to Aaron, that would be his brother, in Newport. There too he observed firsthand the disruption to the household when his host's father-in-law died somewhere in the interior of the country. The commercial relationship had evolved into a personal one by the time Moses Lopez sailed for home 7 weeks later. So basically Jews, I guess is a Jewish term, schmoozin, to keep their connections intact. In addition to providing comfortable arrangements, DaCosta may have assisted Lopez as the visitor sized up business and commerce in Charleston. During his stay, Moses Lopez discovered that the port was a crossroad for ships from the West Indies, Europe, and such North American ports as St. Augustine, Pensacola, Florida, and Mobile, Alabama. Merchant importers sold European goods to the colony's planters, who remained loyal to an individual merchant, even if other traders extended more favorable terms. Great profits could be earned by selling to the inhabitants of the interior, who, Lopez concluded, apparently drove softer bargain than did New Englanders. Substantial profits were to be had in winter when the town's merchants sold provisions to the planters, who came to the city to make their purchases. In addition, the planters typically settled their accounts at New York. Settled their accounts in New York, exchanging their produce for merchandise. Excuse me, there's a mistake here. Exchanging their produce for merchandise imported from abroad. Though these practices meant that payments were often late and debts were sometimes bad, fortunes could be made quickly in Charleston. Commercial information that Moses urged his brother in Newport to convey to another of their contacts, a cousin in Savannah. Because Moses Lopez visited Charleston in the spring of 1764, his information regarding business conditions in South Carolina during the winter months could have come only from a local informant. Whether it was his host who provided this information is not known, but it is certain that Da Costa assisted Lopez in an immediately practical manner the procurement of freight for shipment to England. Unable to sell his brother's vessel, Moses Lopez acquired a cargo of pitch, green tar, and rice, thanks not only to his host's friendliness — the host is Isaac Da Costa — but also his credit and reputation among the leading local merchants. Satisfied, Moses Lopez took ship for home. The successful outcome of his mission to South Carolina secured with the help of another Jew with whom he and his brother had dealt previously only through correspondence. So Jews don't even meet each other personally. I understand, the travel type, but you could still do it, meet a person personal and set up business that way. But Jews are so interconnected that a simple letter will do, especially if you're the Lopezes and one of the most predominant slave traders. The journey by Moses Lopez was typical of those undertaken by the Jewish merchants of colonial North America. Indeed, at times it was an impending voyage that prompted them to compose their last wills and testament. Isaac Rodriguez Marquis, for example, wrote his in 1707 because he contemplated a voyage from New York to Jamaica. So did Abraham de Lucena in 1725, who explained before his trip to Jamaica that, quote, "the dangers of the sea and the uncertainty of this mortal life," unquote, occasioned his will. In similar fashion, Jacob Fonseca in 1729 cited, quote, the danger and hazards unto which I am likely to be exposed," unquote, as he wrote his will before setting out for the Caribbean. While Samuel Myers Cohen, quote, "considering the disasters of the seas," unquote, drew his will in 1743 because he intended to travel to England, a voyage from which he subsequently returned safely to New York. So, Jews, I guess the common practice was, not just for Jews, but probably for anyone, was to make a will before you traveled in the seas, because it's just not safe. The letters of the Franks family between 1733 and 1748 are replete with allusions to the comings and goings of the members of that family. David Franks, the son of Jacob and Abigail Franks, journeyed in 1735 to Boston, where he resided briefly, settled eventually in Philadelphia, contemplated voyages to Jamaica and India. That would mean he's contemplating sugar trade or slave trade, especially in Jamaica, and traveled to Georgia. Moses Franks, a younger son, journeyed to England in 1738, returned to New York in 1739, took up residence in Philadelphia, and soon after settled permanently in England. Coleman Solomons, nephew of Jacob Franks, arrived from London and New York by 1729, returned to England in 1734, and later that year traveled to Philadelphia. In 1735, the family considered sending him to Holland, but instead he journeyed to England, went next to South Carolina in 1736, and returned to New York in 1738. He remained in North America thereafter for at least 3 years and died in England in 1767. Isaac Levy, that's one of the Jews who ran the indentured white slavery, brother of Abigail Franks, journeyed to London in 1740, while a second brother, Asher, voyaged about between England, New York, and Philadelphia. In addition to their extensive journeys across the seas, colonial Jewish merchants established family representatives in as many locations as possible around the Atlantic basin. More family representatives equals more trading connections. Again, the example of the Franks family is instructive. Jacob Franks, the patriarch, arrived in New York from England in 1708 or 1709. Undoubtedly encouraged to immigrate to the New World to represent his London commercial family, with whom he maintained contact for years to come. In or about 1712, he married Abigail Levy, the daughter of Moses Levy, one of New York's Jewish merchants and the father of several sons, who later dispersed to Philadelphia, London, and Jamaica. In this manner, a commercial network linked by family representatives in various ports arose that could benefit not only Moses Levy, but also his son-in-law, Jacob Franks. Subsequently, the three sons of Jacob and Abigail Franks, who grew to maturity, emigrated from New York to other locations, where they too represented one another's mercantile interests. Naphtali Franks, the oldest, settled in London by the spring of 1733, where he quickly integrated himself with his father's brothers and married one of his cousins. So Jews have no problem with incest. Married his cousin. He never returned from England to the New World, but from what was in effect his commercial station in London, he maintained trading connections with his father in New York and his brother David in Philadelphia. The third brother, Moses, settled for a time in Philadelphia, but eventually immigrated to England, joining his older brother and thus rounding out the Franks family network on the two sides of the Atlantic. Supplementing this network, Moses Solomon, one of Jacob Franks' nephews, resided in Charleston, from where he too traded with other members of the family. That dispersal of the family was indispensable to commercial success was eminently clear to Abigail Franks, who nonetheless bemoaned it. To her son Naphtali, gone permanently to England, she wrote in 1741, quote, I wish but for the happiness of seeing you, which I began to fear I never shall, for I don't wish you here, and I am sure there is little probability of me going to England. If parents would give themselves leave to consider the many difficulties that attends the bringing up of children, there would not be such immoderate joy at their birth. I don't mean the care of their infancy, that's the least, but it's after they are grown up and behave in such a manner as to give satisfaction than to be bereaved of them in the decline of life, when the enjoying of them would be our greatest happiness, for the cares of getting a living disperses them up and down the world, and the only pleasure we enjoy that's intermixed with anxiety is to hear they do well, which is a pleasure I hope to have. That's from Naphtali Frank's mother. What she basically says is, make money, son. I don't care if you have to move away. The proclivity for travel that characterized the colonial Jewish merchant brought in its wake the problem of impoverished Jews who also journeyed from place to place about the Atlantic. The organized Jewish community assisted poor strangers financially and then sent them on their way by paying their transportation charges. New York's Jewish congregation, for example, in 1728 decided to care for unmarried transients by providing them with 8 shillings a week for as long as 3 months and to expend up to £2 for fare to another port. For families, the amounts allocated were to be determined by the community's leaders. Thereafter, the community assisted wandering Jews who turned up in New York before dispatching them to London, Barbados, St. Croix, Curaçao, Suriname, Philadelphia, and Charleston. Thus, when Jacob Moschetti in 1768 arrived in New York from St. Eustace in need of assistance and requested passage to Barbados, the community's elders sent him as far as Philadelphia and wrote to Michael Gratz asking him to collect funds from the Jewish population there to enable the traveler to continue his journey. Similarly, 2 years later, Jacob Rodriguez Rivera of Newport used his connections to find ship passage for an impoverished individual from St. Eustace who, ostensibly seeking to travel to Suriname, had arrived in Rhode Island. Though whether Rivera acted on his own or as the agent of the synagogue of Newport is not known. The importance of personal connections to community also encompassed marriage. By joining families residing in distant locations around the Atlantic, marriage solidified commercial networks, rooting them in ties that were deeper than those provided by mere membership in the same religious group, valuable though that alone was. To be sure, the small Jewish population in any one location, the resulting paucity in the number of eligible partners as one neared the age of marriage, and the commitment to marriage within the faith, a fundamental requirement of the Jewish religion, forced families to look beyond the confines of their communities to the larger domain of the Atlantic. Nevertheless, transatlantic marriages among Jews also bestowed commercial advantages, supplementing religious reasons for seeking a spouse for oneself or for one's child in a distant port. The history of the first 3 generations of the Gomez clan of New York provides perhaps the best example during the colonial era of how a family, through marriage, established ties across many thousands of miles. Louis Moses Gomez, the patriarch of the family, was born in Madrid between 1654 and 1660. Moved with his father to France, undoubtedly to escape the resurgent Inquisition of the mid-17th century, and from France eventually immigrated to New York. There he became a man of commerce, played a leading part during the late 1720s in building New York's first permanent synagogue, and died in 1740. Sometime after his arrival in New York, Luis Moses Gomez married Esther Marquise, a woman whose family had ties to the island of Barbados, for, following the death of her father in New York, her mother married a member of that island's Jewish community, while her brother died there in 1725. Louis Moses and Esther Gomez gave birth to 6 sons, one of whom perished in 1722 during a voyage to the Caribbean, murdered probably by Spaniards on the island of Cuba. Of the remaining 5 sons, at least 2 married women who came from the Caribbean island, thus extending the family's ties with the Caribbean. Their 3rd son, Daniel, first married Rebecca de Torres, whose father and brother resided in Jamaica, and then Esther Levy of Caraco, while their 6th son, Benjamin, became the husband of Esther Nunez of Barbados. That these connections bore fruit in commerce is apparent from the ledger that has been ascribed to Daniel Gomez, in which he posted accounts of his dealings in 1745 with Jacob de Hosea Nara, and in 1748 with Aaron the Shavs, both of whom he identified as his brothers-in-law in Caraco. In addition, he recorded transcripts in 1744 with Isaac and Benjamin Gomez of Barbados. Perhaps the later was the brother who had married Esther Nunez of that island. The Gomez family's ties may have extended even more distantly across the Atlantic, for Daniel Gomez also conducted business in 1751 with a Miguel Gomez, whom he described as a merchant on the island of Madeira. The 3rd generation of the Gomez family continued the pattern. Mordecai Gomez, the eldest son of Louis and Esther, Mordecai Gomez, the eldest son of Louis and Esther, was the father of 7 children, only one of whom, Eve Esther, married a resident of New York, Uriah Hendricks. 2 sons died without marrying, while the remaining 4 children wed individuals from other Atlantic locations. Sons Moses and Isaac married in Jamaica and Caraco, respectively, while another daughter married in England. She returned with her husband to New York, only to return to England because of his adherence to the crown during the American Revolution. The seventh child, Moses M. Gomez, married Esther Lopez, a daughter of the Newport's Aaron Lopez. So that's the slave trading Jew. This liaison, however, did not provide the only connection between the two families for another member of the large Gomez clan. Isaac Gomez Jr. married Abigail Lopez, another of Aaron Lopez's children. Marriages uniting the Gomez family of New York and the Lopez family of Newport indicate that colonial America's Jewish inhabitants sought to establish family networks in the ports along the coast of North America as well in the islands of the Caribbean. The webs that they created tied together the Jews of Newport and Savannah, of Charleston, and Philadelphia, and all of these to New York, underpinning trade and contributing to the continuity of the Jewish presence in the colonies. Relationships built upon marriages reached inland as well. Joseph Simon in Lancaster wed a woman whose family resided in New York and whose uncle Samuel Myers Cohen identified himself as a merchant in his will. Bernard Grants in Philadelphia, one of Simon's important commercial correspondents, married a daughter of the same Samuel Myers Cohen, thus linking himself not only to the New York merchant, but to Joseph Simon as well. Simon subsequently married off one of his daughters to Michael Gratz of Philadelphia, who with his brother conducted an extensive trade to the west in conjunction with his father-in-law, eventually becoming his partner in speculation in western lands. Connections based upon marriage ties, of course, did not automatically guarantee commercial success. As Aaron Lopez discovered in the late 1760s, eager to expand and solidify trade with the island of Jamaica, Lopez endeavored to enlist Isaac Pereira Mendez, a Jamaica merchant, to serve as his commercial agent. Isaac Mendez declined, but recommended his brother Abraham Mendez instead, who happened to be Lopez's son-in-law. Lopez thereupon dispatched his daughter and son-in-law to Jamaica, where, despite the offer of Isaac to assist Abraham, quote, with zeal and brotherly love, unquote, Abraham failed dismally as a resident commercial agent, necessitating his recall to Rhode Island. Though a failure commercially, the union of Abraham Mendez and Sarah Lopez united two individuals who, in the absence of tradition of Jewish transatlantic marriage, might have abandoned their ethnic group and their religion to assimilate and disappear as Jews. Membership in a community that settled the Atlantic thus contributed to the distinctiveness of the Jewish settlers as a recognizable group within colonial society at the same time that it played a role in forming commercial ties. It did so not only through marriages, but also by encouraging the organized Jewish communities of the Atlantic to assist each other in religious matters. The reliance of Savannah's Jews upon a member of the London Jewish community for religious objects in 1737 was not an isolated incident, but rather a significant feature of religious life in colonial America. Counting similarly upon the network of Jewish communities around the Atlantic, when Charleston's congregation created a board of trustees for its new cemetery in 1764, it appointed representatives of the congregations of New York, Newport, Savannah, and Jamaica to it. To construct permanent synagogues and other structures, the colonists relied upon the resources of individual contributors and congregations in other localities. When it undertook to build its first permanent structure in 1728, New York's congregation wrote to Jamaica Synagogue to request funds. It also received donations from individuals in Boston, London, Jamaica, and the Barbados, as well as a substantial sum from the congregation of Curaçao. Several years later, it recorded a contribution from a resident of Barbados, earmarked as she specified, to build a wall around the community's center. The community also probably benefited from a contribution by one of London's Jews for the construction of its school building in 1731. New York's Jews in turn assisted Newport Jews when they began to build their synagogue in the late 1750s, lending them the Torah scroll that formerly had belonged to the original community in Savannah, and donating funds toward the construction of the building. Newport's congregation, in addition, received financial assistance from the Jewish communities of Suriname, Jamaica, Curacao, and London, as well as Torah scrolls from London's and Amsterdam's congregations. Likewise, Philadelphia's emerging congregation received a Torah scroll from New York in 1761. The Atlantic congregation also turned to each other for salaried religious functionaries. In 1757, for example, the New York community wrote to London to find a Hazan qualified to teach Hebrew, English, and Spanish to its children, as well as to lead the synagogue services. 8 years later, when their Hazan informed them of his intention to resign, the congregation resolved that, quote, notices thereof may be given to foreign parts, unquote, inviting candidates from abroad to travel to New York at their own expense to apply for the position. Similarly, when the community's ritual slaughter resigned in 1775, the congregation directed its officers to write to Newport and Philadelphia asking for qualified candidates. Finally, the Jewish inhabitants of North America were drawn into contact with their religious brethren in the Atlantic region because of their commerce in the meat slaughtered according to religious law. Now, if any of you have seen how kosher meat is done, it is one of the most barbaric things done to animals. They literally pierce the throat of the animal and just let the blood drain. That is actually what makes this meat kosher. Aaron Lopez of Newport, for example, was well known in Jamaica for his export of kosher meat there, while other Newport Jews exported meat to Suriname, Barbados, and Jamaica. From Philadelphia, Michael Grates began to export kosher meat to Barbados and probably Curacao, following his journey to the West Indies in 1765. New York's congregation devised a seal in 1752 to attest to the ritual purity of meat exported from the city under their supervision, and in 1757 responded to charges and rumors in Jamaica and Curacao that meat exported from New York was not kosher. Denying the allegations, the New Yorkers assured their correspondents that they would do all that was required to protect the regulations of the Jewish faith. Impelled by religious as well as commercial considerations, the Jews of colonial America participated in a world far more expansive than their small provincial cities in the New World. Instead of being isolated in their small towns, they had access to the resources of a large community, thereby increasing their chances for successful settlement in the American colonies. Trading, traveling, and marrying widely, their perspective embraced the entire Atlantic region to the advantage simultaneously of their religious commitments and their worldly interests. And yet, concurrently with their outward cosmopolitan gaze, they tended as well to their intermediate surroundings, diligently working to establish flourishing Jewish communities in the New World. Their efforts will be seen, as will be seen, took them into uncharted waters, for the Jewish inhabitants of colonial America were among the first to experiment with a new kind of Jewish community in the modern world. And that is the end of this chapter, the Atlantic world of colonial Jewry. We learned a lot in this chapter, folks, and I encourage all listeners to take part in the forum discussion, as I mentioned earlier. Thanks for listening, folks.